Okay, good morning. This is Richard Hsu. This morning I'm really thrilled and honored to have with me as my guest Professor Jonah Berger, who's a professor at Wharton. Jonah, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
So Jonah, I'm super excited, looking forward to this call. Tell me how do you describe kind of your main area of research? What is your answer at the cocktail party when somebody says, what do you do?
So in general, I'm a behavioral scientist. In my day job, I'm a professor of marketing at the Wharton School. In terms of research, I spend a lot of time thinking about why things catch on. So why products, ideas, behaviors become popular. And most recently have been using natural language processing or automated textual analysis to answer these questions using kind of language data. So we share language in a variety of ways, but it's often difficult to parse. And so using some new technologies that have come out of computer science and information science, the things we can learn about language from what we say.
How did you get into this area of research? How did this intrigue you?
Growing up, I went to a magnet high school, so a math, science, computer science sort of high school. I wasn't sure that I was going to do that stuff when I grew up, so I wasn't thinking I'd be a computer scientist. But I always found those topics interesting, and particularly thought it would be neat to apply those ideas of rigorous experimentation and data analysis to the social sciences. And so have always been fascinated by why things become popular. We see movies that are hits, we see books that are blockbusters, we see apps that catch on, but it's always hard to tell why. Over the past kind of decade or so, have been using these new tools that have emerged to kind of parse whether it's content or ideas or language more generally for insight into those questions.
Tell me the first example of something you discovered of why it caught on and how that intrigued you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you an example of a study we did a while ago, but that got me a little bit interested in this space. So, did a bit of research on why content goes viral. So, a few years ago, I analyzed thousands of articles from the New York Times, some of which made the most emailed list, and some didn't. And looked at that content to kind of figure out why, right? I mean, we've all seen most emailed lists, most shared lists. We've all seen content go viral. Lots of people have opinions about why things may have gone viral, but they often don't really have answers. And so what we did is we actually took that content and broke it down into component pieces. So we analyzed articles, for example, to say, well, how much emotional language did it contain? How useful was this content? How surprising was this content? And then did statistical analyses to say, hey, controlling for everything else, what are features of content, ways we can write articles or ways we can put together information that shapes whether people share it or not.
Interesting. Well, now tell me, you're about to release, I guess you completed writing this book, Magic Words. Tell me a little bit about the origin of that and how you came up with the idea.
Yeah. So I think what I'll say is this, everything we do, basically everything we do in one way, shape or form involves words, right? So you and I are talking to one another right now using words. We use language to write emails and make PowerPoint presentations. We use language to pitch ideas and text friends and colleagues. Even our own private thoughts rely on language. But while we spend a lot of time thinking about what we're saying, right now we're talking about this new book that I have coming out, and I want to share some of the ideas from it. We don't often spend as much time thinking about the specific words we use when talking about those ideas. So if I'm in a meeting, for example, and I'm pitching a new idea, I know that I want to talk about this idea. I don't always think about the exact words to use to talk about it. But it turns out that's a big mistake because subtle shifts in language can have a big impact on how effective we are, whether it is as salespeople, whether it is as leaders, whether it is as colleagues, even in our personal lives. The words we use affect how persuasive we are, how good we are at holding an audience's attention, or even how good we are at deepening social connections with the ones we love. And so I got started using language and natural language processing a few years ago in that paper that I mentioned on the New York Times most emailed list. And we used very basic tools then. This was about 10 years ago. And so really there wasn't as much language data out there as there is today. But in the decade that's passed, lots of stuff has become digitized. It's not just online content. This conversation that we're having can easily be transcribed in an automated way. Our social media posts provide written records of our thoughts and attitudes towards everything from vacation destinations to experiences with service providers. Resumes have been digitized. Email language within companies can be analyzed. And so we're sitting on this vast reams and reams of data that we can use, but the tools have also improved a lot also. So lots of new technologies in machine learning and natural language processing and other types of automated text analysis that have allowed us to parse this data for insight. And so the new science of language, building on all this technology, has allowed us to uncover some pretty cool and pretty useful stuff.
Well, I know you have a lot of examples in your book, but share with us one example of, where the power of words can really make a difference, or a slight, change can really make a difference.
Yeah, so first, just to give you an overview, there are 6 types of language, or 6 types of words that I talk about in the book. Together, they spell the word speak. It's an acronym. It actually has 2 C's, but helping us think about how to speak more effectively. And the S stands for similarity. The P stands for how we pose questions. The E is for emotion. The A is for the language of agency and identity. One of the C's is for confidence, and one of the C's is for concreteness. And so there are chapters on each of those types of language, and not just what they are, but how we can use them. And so to give you a specific example, often when we ask others to do something, we use verbs. And what do I mean by that? Well, if we want someone to help us, we say, "Can you help me? Can you help me out?" Or if we're a nonprofit trying to get voters to turn out to the polls, we might say, "Hey, please go vote." We use the verb help, or the word vote, the verb vote, to try to change people's behavior. And it's clear why we think that will be effective, but it turns out a subtle shift in the words we use, in fact, even just a couple letters, can have a big impact. So a number of years ago, they did a study, and this was actually with elementary school kids. The playroom was a mess, and they asked the kids for help cleaning up. And for some of the kids, they said, "Hey, can you help clean up?" As we often do. But for another set of kids, they used a slightly different approach. They said, "Hey, can you be a helper and clean up?" Now, again, the difference between help and helper is infinitesimally small, right?
Yeah.
It's adding 2 letters, ER, on the end of help. But they found that this small shift led to about a 30% increase in the portion of kids that helped. And you might say, "Well, that's nice, but I mean, those are kids. What does it really matter?" Well, more recently, there was a study that came out in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences where they did this with voting. So they mailed information to tens of thousands of voters, trying to get them to turn out. And for some people, they said, "Hey, can you vote?" As we often do with the verb vote. And for others, they said, "Can you be a voter?" And turn out to vote. And in this context, they found that asking people to be a voter, again, very small in this case, adding an R to the word vote, led to about a 15% increase in the number of people that voted. And so one question you could ask yourself is why, right? What's the difference between voting and being a voter, or helping and being a helper?
Yeah.
If you think about it, we can describe people in terms of traits, adjectives, verbs, or nouns, right? We can say someone runs, that's an action they might take, or they are runner. We can say someone is a liberal, or they are liberal. We can say someone loves dogs, or they're a dog lover, right? In all of those cases, the same type of ideas can be explained slightly differently. But if I asked you, "Hey, who runs more?" Someone who says that they run, or someone who says they are a runner, which would you assume runs more often?
Yeah, the runner.
The runner,
Yeah.
right? And so when we use language to describe things as identities, they seem more fixed. Someone who is a runner, well, they must be really into running. Well, someone who just runs, they do it once in a while. And so everyone wants to hold desirable identities, right? We want to be in good shape and smart and helpful and nice and all those other characteristics. And so if we can turn actions, verbs, into identities, if they're desirable identities, people are more likely to go along, because doing that action is a way to show themselves that they hold that desirable identity. And so when we ask people to help, they say, "Well, helping's nice." But when we say be a helper, well, now helping becomes an opportunity to claim this desired identity. A way, as a kid, I want to see myself. Same thing with voting, right? As a member of the population, voting's nice, but being a voter, well, that's a good thing to feel about oneself. It's good to feel that I'm a voter. I'm a good member of the popular opportunity to become a voter, well, now I'm more likely to do it. And so the key takeaway here is we need to turn actions into identities, right? Rather than asking people to do something, if it's a desirable thing, ask them to hold that identity that doing it is, right? So rather than asking someone to lead, ask them to be a leader, right? Rather than asking someone to innovate, ask them to be an innovator, right? Framing those same things in a slightly different way will make people more likely to do it. The same thing actually holds on the other side, but in a different way. Let's say there's a negative thing that we don't want people to do. There was a nice study, for example, that looked at cheating. Well, if you say, don't cheat, right, people say, okay, cheating's a bad idea. But you say, don't be a cheater. Well, hold on, being a cheater is much worse than cheating, just like being a loser is much worse than losing. And so people are less likely to cheat when doing so would confirm them as holding that identity of being a cheater. And so if we want people not to do something, we'll frame that thing we don't want them to do as an identity. And so this has implications for a variety of things. It has implications for changing other people's behaviors. It even has implications for ways that we talk about others, right? We want someone to seem like they're very innovative, talk about them as an innovator. Don't talk about yourself in a resume as a hard working. Talk about yourself as a hard worker, right? Not the adjective, but the identity. It'll make that thing seem more persistent over time and make people think you're more likely to follow through on it.
Well, that's fascinating, really fascinating. Now, tell me, I mean, there's an infinite number of words, obviously, you can study and the effects of them. How did you winnow it down to those 6 areas? I mean, what process did you do to do that?
Yeah, this is an area that I've personally been working in now for over a decade. We've looked at hundreds of customer service calls to look at the language that increases customer satisfaction. We've looked at tens of thousands of pieces of online content to look at what holds attention. We've looked at conversations. We've looked at sales pitches. We've looked at PowerPoint decks. We've even looked at parole hearings and the language that people use in those contexts. And so some of this came out of what I and my colleagues have done, as well as the interesting work I've seen others do. As you noted, the space is almost infinite, but that by itself doesn't matter, right? What matters is what we can do with this. And so what I like a lot about that idea of, for example, turning actions into identities is I can see how I, as an individual, can apply it, right? I can see what I can do tomorrow to make my life a bit better off. And so the book starts a little bit more tactically. Here are some, approaches you can use as a leader, as a salesperson, as a parent, as a doctor, whatever it might be, to increase your impact. Later in the book, there's some broader things about what language reveals about society, sexism, racism, how we can gain insight into customers from their language. And those are kind of less tractable things for individuals, but I think equally important for organizations or us as humans.
How much of this book was using studies that had already done, and then you kind of, figured out the themes or deduced the conclusions versus actual studies you did informing this book, like studies that you carried out to test your thesis on the book?
I haven't counted. There's a bunch of both. So, I mentioned some of the customer service language work we've done. That's in the chapter on concreteness. I mentioned some of the work that we've done with content and what holds attention. That's in the chapter on emotion. So it just depends. There's been amazing work out in the last decade and even before then going on in this space. And so it's some of my work, but it's also highlighting some of the great work that others have done as well.
Now, I'm sure when you went into the book, just like any author or any researcher, you have kind of an idea or thesis that you're, thinking you're going to prove or disprove. Was there anything that in your research that you discovered that you weren't expecting or changed your mind or view on something?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about how impactful language is. So take something like asking someone to vote versus being a voter. That seems like a really small shift, but it has a big impact. Or let me give you another one. There was a nice study looking at problem solving. So, whatever role we have, whatever our job is, we're often trying to solve problems. We're often trying to, think creatively as it might be, but that's often really hard to do. And so how can we kind of come up with better solutions? And so what this research found is often what we do when we're trying to think creatively, trying to solve a problem, we think about what we should do, right? What should I do in this situation? What's the best course of action? And while that can be good in some ways, that can be a little bit constraining, right? By focusing on what we should do, we kind of only think about the set of things that seem right and that restrict our thinking. And so what they did for another set of people is they said, don't think about what you should do, right? Think about what you could do first. not what you should do, what you could do. Now, again, this feels infinitesimally small, right? Like the word could versus the word should is one word, very, very small difference. Yet it led people in a variety of situations to come up with much more creative solutions, much more better solving problems by thinking about this approach slightly differently. And so what I think has been neat for me is that the array of areas of life that this applies to, whether you're a leader, whether you're an employee, whether you're a parent, whatever your role is, whatever you're trying to do, whatever outcome you're trying to achieve, language can help us there if we understand how to use it.
Yeah, totally. It sounds like the impact of this would you say was even greater than what you thought? I mean, it sounds like, you're seeing impact with, as you said, infinitesimal small differences. Were you even surprised at how powerful those were?
I've been a behavioral scientist for a while, so it takes a lot to completely surprise me. But I think it's neat for me to see how consistent the evidence is, not just how large these effects are, but how consistent they are, and how they apply to a variety of areas of life. And so that's what I found to be most neat.
Was there what was the most surprising thing that you learned in researching and doing this book, would you say?
There's not one surprising thing. There's a lot of interesting and useful content. I'll give you another example. So, often we think that we shouldn't ask for advice. And what do I mean by that? Well, we're at work, we're dealing with a tough problem. I shouldn't ask my boss or colleague what they think. Why? Because they'll think less of me, right? They'll think, you don't know what you're doing. Why couldn't you solve this yourself? Maybe the person I ask will be busy. They won't want to answer. And so I don't ask them. And that makes sense. But it turns out that intuition is misguided. And so some researchers out of both Wharton and Harvard did some nice studies on asking for advice. So they put people in experiments, for example, where in some situations they were interacting with a partner and that partner either did or didn't ask for advice, for example. And what they found, kind of surprisingly, is that asking for advice doesn't make us look worse, and it doesn't have no effect. It actually makes us look better. Why would asking for advice make us look better? Why would it make us look smarter and more competent? And the reason is that people, right, think their advice is pretty good. People tend to think they're pretty smart. People tend to like themselves. People tend to think, well, I have good advice, right? Of course, we all think our advice is good. And so when someone else asks us for advice, we don't go, oh, wow, they don't know very much. We go, oh, they must be pretty smart because my advice is pretty good. And so if they're asking me for my advice, they must be pretty competent. And so we actually look better when we ask for advice, not worse. And so I think there's just so many situations where intuition isn't exactly right, and we're missing out on a lot of opportunities by not understanding how to use language.
Well, the interesting thing about this is that, and I'm sure you discovered this, is that, the examples that you've given, like everything you're saying, like, for example, the noun to the verb, the runner versus someone who runs, and then asking which one is more compelling. I mean, it resonates with me personally, but I haven't done any research or anything like that. Like, I mean, I'm sure that's what seems like it makes it very interesting. Like, not like you had to persuade me that this is going to be more effective than the other. It just, that makes sense. I mean, I can feel it myself as you're describing the example.
Yeah, I mean, what I also find so interesting about this is building on what you just said. I think we have this intuition that some people are just better persuaders than others, right? They're more confident, they're more charismatic, they're better writers, they're better speakers. I am never going to be that person is what we often think. And we think this is kind of something that you're born with, right? Either you have it or you don't, right? What is charisma? What is being a good writer? You got those skills or you don't. And what I found through doing this research is anyone, right? Anyone can become more persuasive. Anyone can, deepen connection with their loved ones. Anyone can hold their audience's attention better if they understand how this works. And so these things are just tools, right? They may not make us the most persuasive person we've ever met, but they can certainly increase our impact in a variety of different ways just by understanding how magic words work.
Now, I know writing any book is extremely laborious and takes a ton of work, but it sounds like you really had a lot of fun with this project. I mean, what would you say about that?
I have been working on this book for a while. In the back of my head. My most recent book before this book, The Catalyst, which I think is this yellow one right there. While I was writing this book, I was like, The Catalyst, I was like, oh man, should I write this book on language? This is what I'm doing research on. but I had already sort of proposed the catalyst, and I didn't think the language stuff was far along. And so I finished the catalyst and did some work around that, and have continued to do research in this space. But it was fun kind of exploring different aspects of language that I hadn't thought as much about before. So emotions, for example, I had thought some about, but identity and agency was something I didn't know as much about. There's some great work by a guy named Evan Cross on self-talk, and how actually talking to ourselves can reduce our anxiety and help us perform better in different situations. I didn't know about that work before kind of diving into this space, but it's fascinating stuff and so powerful and useful. And so it's been neat throughout writing this book. I wouldn't say it's been easy. Writing a book is never easy, but it's been neat to see the different ways we can use language and how it can improve our lives.
Yeah, I had Ethan on my show a few weeks ago. He wrote the book Chatter, right? Chatter.
Yes. Yeah. Great
he was
book.
fantastic. Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of the things you talk about, I mean, like I want to go back to the point about, it seems like almost intuitive. Maybe you had to, you broke that scientific. I mean, was that kind of your thinking, like you had kind of like this intuition about certain things, and then you just kind of had to find the evidence to support it, or what would you say?
Not at all. On a project on holding attention, for example, there we have some rich data on how people read content online. So we not only know whether people click on an article, but how much of it they actually read. How far down the page do they scroll down? Now, if you asked me ahead of time, well, what holds people's attention?
Yeah,
I'm not sure that we know, right? We know a lot about clickbait. We know a lot about kind of how to get people to click on something and hate us afterwards because the content didn't deliver. But we really don't know a lot about what holds people's attention. There's some old psychological research on if you force people to read something, how interesting they found what they read and how much do they learn from it. But, there was never any data on, well, how far down a newspaper article do people read, because the digital data wasn't available. But now both the access to the data as well as the tools to parse that data have allowed us to understand more about what holds attention. And so, as I talk about a variety of different emotions help us hold attention, not just emotions that kind of fire us up and not just positive or negative emotions, but emotions that evoke uncertainty. I think often as presenters, we sort of want to give people the answer, say, this is the top line. Well, it turns out that using more uncertain language, both evoking emotions that involve uncertainty, as well as other types of uncertain language, keep people staying tuned because they want to figure out what's going to happen. And so that's a way where we can hold people's attention by writing or speaking a bit differently. Going into that project, I didn't know ahead of time what features were going to matter, but we analyzed a variety of different features and kind of looked at which ones were most important.
Well, you've alluded several times on how important having the technology is to be able to do this research. It sounds like this book could not have been written 30 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago. I mean, is that true?
Certainly some of the research couldn't have been. So, I've talked a lot about how we use language to impact others, but we can also gain insight about others from their language. There's a study a friend of mine did looking at loans. So they look at a bunch of people applying for loans, and at the end, a few months or years later, they know whether people default on those loans. So it's on a crowdfunding place. People apply for money, they get funded. Some of them pay the money back, some don't. And if you were an economist or a finance professor, you'd say, well, it's all about their demographics, who they are, their FICO score, how good they are with money. And sure, that stuff matters. But even above and beyond that, they find the language that people use in their application provides insight, helps us predict whether someone's going to default on their loan or not. Now, 50 years ago, could we have studied that? Maybe. I mean, we'd have to have a whole bunch of research assistants read through these different things and hand code them based on whatever dimensions we want. Now what we can do is we can run these pieces of text through a whole bunch of analytics and software, pulling out important features of that text and help us look at statistically which of those features are linked to the outcome. And they find, sure enough, controlling for everything else, even though obviously people don't want to seem like they're going to default, but it leaks through in the language they use in their applications. Even though no one wants you to know that they're going to default, we can predict extra predictive power based on what they said. And so both the data availability as well as the analytic tools have enabled that to happen. And sure, maybe things like that might have been possible before, but certainly not to the same scale as they are today.
Now, since you've been studying this for a while, have you had any personal experience when have this has influenced the way you speak or the way you talk? Has it helped you as, as a teacher, as a consultant, as a persuader, perhaps a parent? I mean, like, tell me about your personal experience with it in your life since you have
Yeah.
this great knowledge now.
I'll say a couple things. So first of all, I'll tell you a personal story, and then I'll talk about applying it. But a few years ago, our first child was born. His name is Jasper, and as with many children, after a certain period, he started to acquire words to describe things in his environment that he wanted to talk about. So there was, brow bear, which was his brown bear. There was yo, which is yogurt. And a variety of different things. But one of the most interesting words that he started using was the word peas. And so he couldn't pronounce his L yet. So he actually meant please. But he'd use it in a very interesting way, which is he'd say like, yo, when he wanted to eat yogurt, yo, and he'd shake his head, yo, and he'd shake his head. And if yogurt came, that would be the end of it. But if yogurt didn't come, he'd go, yo, peas, yo, peas. And what he had discovered is, look, if I don't get what I want, right, adding this additional word will make it more likely that happens. And, he's learned a lot now. He's almost 6 years old. He's learned a lot of language since then, obviously, including language that greatly frustrates me. A couple nights ago, I asked him to do something. He told me I wasn't specific enough with my request for him. But this was kind of his first magic word, right? He discovered the power of language. And so I think personally, it's been neat to see this. I think also I would say, in my own life as a professor, as a writer, as a speaker, I think a lot about these tools. I think, about 10 years ago, 2013, my first book, the orange one, Contagious, came out, and it changed my life a little bit. Before then, I was completely an academic. I spent 95% of my time doing teaching and research. And that book came out and kind of changed my life. It's out now, I think, in 1.5 million, 2 million copies in 35 languages around the world. And I've gotten opportunities to work with a lot of companies and organizations, everything from big 500, Fortune 500 companies like the Googles and Nikes and Apples to small startups. But what I found again and again was, wow, why do certain ideas resonate, right? Research is research. The academic research in that book is good research, but certain books do much better than others, not just because of the ideas, but because of the way they're written. And so I started to wonder, could we, thinking sort of mathematically, could we in some sense figure out mathematically what the right way to write a story is? I don't know if you ever tried to write a story, but, okay, how many pages of or paragraphs of background should there be? What's the right way to express a punchline? If you look at comedians, you often see they spend a lot of time honing not just what to say, but how to say it.
Yeah,
What's the exact right way to reveal this joke so it has more impact? And so I think about that a lot as a writer and a speaker. And part of what I've been fascinated with is the ability to analyze some of these things, right? So we've analyzed academic papers to look at what leads them to be cited more. We've looked at song lyrics to understand what makes hits. We've looked at movie scripts to understand what makes people enjoy movies and television shows more. And is it perfect? No, we certainly have a lot more to learn, but by thinking in some senses language as math and almost as being able to structure in a particular way, we can think about, well, why might it have better outcomes and how can we design content that's more impactful?
Well, Jonah, this has been such a fascinating conversation. I'm super excited to read your book, and I'm really appreciate your taking the time to speak with me. If you ever, I can't wait to talk to you again for your next idea.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
This is Richard Hsu and Jonah Berger. Thanks.